Thank you for coming, first of all. I last did a talk, as far as I can remember, on Lila and her window 25 years ago. I discovered from the papers I printed out at the time. And I had as I told Logan, I have a really nice little box of Kodachrome slides that illustrated the talk. I have no idea where they are. I don't think I gave them to the library. I probably kept them for myself. And guaranteed a couple days after this talk, I will find them. They were close-ups. As my job as a janitor here at Bosler Memorial Library, and later exercising the privilege that Jeff Swope and Tiffany and Harry have given me, I have examined the window very up close. A Zen master of a stained glass artist, Dan Hayward, and I recently stood micromillimeters away from it to examine the repairs made to the glass, the details of how the glass achieved its effect. I learned a lot about the techniques of glass with him, and I have been living with Lila now over 40 years. I was a janitor here in the early 1980s, and I just realized with a shock that I have lived with Lila as long as William Homer Ames did, who was the librarian here, from 1903 to 1944. Wow, that makes me feel incredibly young and spry. We spoke of Homer Ames last time at length because accepting the current occupier of the executive director of Bosler Memorial Library, there have been two great librarians in Bosler history. And that, of course, is William Homer Ames from 1903 to 1944, and Linda Rice. And I won't give you her dates because she's sitting here. She may feel a little self-conscious. William Homer Ames has one classic photograph of him here at the library. And he's standing behind a solid wood counter between the entrance area to the old Bosler Library and then the closed stacks behind him. And you can see all the books on those lovely shelves which are still there. And he's standing looking magisterial and in control, although he was small and humble in appearance. But above him, you see Lila's window. And it's interesting for me to reflect that everything is in dark wood. All the bindings of all the books are dark. Everything has this severe classical temple of learning look to it, except for what must have been the morning light coming through Lila's window and overexposing it. And so there's this explosion of sort of shimmering diamond light in this black and white photograph. And it just, it illuminates, it sort of flows in over the picture. And then as you see the contrast between the darkness of the counter and the darkness of the books and the darkness of the lower depths. But there's this amazing, it washes out some of the details. You can see the woman figure and you can see the shape of the window, but everything is overexposed because the light is so bright. William Homer Ames, Homer lived with the memorial window for 40 years. Remember, he literally lived there, and this is from the last talk, he literally lived with her because he moved in during the Great Depression when the board of directors couldn't pay him and he had to have somewhere to live, and the library was his life, so he might as well live where his life was. And so he had access to Lila's window 24 hours of the clock, which is evocative to me because I have seen her as the patron goddess of an open functioning library in the old section. And then I have seen her make the transfer during the rebuilding, which removed her from direct light by adding a addition onto the south end of the Bosler. And I have seen her many, many, many times up close. There used to be in the lower part of the windows, to either side of her feet, there used to be crank windows where you could open up to get the evening breeze from the south. And I remember as a janitor opening those to get a little cross ventilation sometimes when I was cleaning the building in the summer. And then of course I would conscientiously close them. But so she is a presence, and she became more than a visual presence to me by looking into her story. She became, in a sense, the symbol, the gesture of a real life human being. But let's talk about the memorial first. Let's talk about the technical details that Dan and I went over so carefully, and then I was able to give him details. Let's talk about the architecture, the visual, the abstraction of the window. There are three stages to a stained glass window, even one as magnificent as this. They're all the same. You have a commission, you have an execution, and you have an installation. The commission, which I'll mention a little more in detail in a moment, came through after John Herman Bosler's death in 1896, before the building was finished in 1899, so it could be part of the building from day one. It was not a later addition. The building was built to accommodate the window, as the window was built to fit into what the building would be. It was a mutual synchronizes gesture, architectural gesture. The execution was done by Maitland Armstrong and Company of New York City, and I'll tell you what an execution is in a minute. And then the placement was by C.D. Rudy of Harrisburg, who was a familiar contractor to install and care for and repair and renovate stained glass windows at the time. Remember, this is the last few years of the 1800s. The commission came from the Bosler family knowing something about a commission given by a woman in Massachusetts, a Mrs. George Martson Witten of Whitensville, Massachusetts. You can tell landed money here. And she asked the great artist Edward Burne-Jones of England, who was one of the most famous artists in the Western world at the time. She asked him for a figure of a woman dancing. Even though he was young, Edward Burne-Jones was in his early 60s at the time, and really, at my age, that's really young, okay? He was feeling near the end of his life, and he had recently lost his best friend, the artist and craftsman William Morris, and he could not do a new painting of a woman dancing. He said, "I am in the mood for a memorial, Mrs. Witten, and that's what I would like to give you." Edward Burne-Jones was a little unusual at the time because he wasn't a pure artist who could overlook minor matters like money. He loved to have commissions from people who paid him. And he said, "I will do your commission, but I want it to be a memorial to my friend William Morris." And as I would have at the time, Mrs. Witten said, "Absolutely, sure, yes sir, that'd be great, no problem. I get a Burne-Jones for whatever he wants to do." And he did this lovely painting called Hope. He actually named it the Latin word space, which means, it was S-P-E-S, which means hope in Latin. And he delivered it to her. It was delivered to her in Massachusetts. It now resides in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. So we have the original painting, that Lila's window is based on. What's intriguing is that original painting was based on a cartoon, that's a technical word, for a stained glass window that Burne-Jones did in 1871, over 25 years before. What is a cartoon to a stained glass master, a designer like Burne-Jones? It is the literal template that you create a stained glass window for. It can be done on a board, sometimes it's done on lighter material, but I have a sneaking suspicion that Burne-Jones did his on a board. You then outline with tin or with lead what the lines will be of the figure in the window, and you've done it on a bed on this board of chalk, generally. And then you begin to cut glass to fit the outlines that you have created with your lead or tin. And eventually, out of a nice sturdy bed and the frame of the lead or the tin, and then the cut stained glass that is then fused and soldered to the framework of the structure, you begin to achieve a stained glass window. A cartoon is not, to your 20th century mind, what you read in the funny papers or see on TV. It is the fundamental substructure of a stained glass window. In his career, remember he died, Burne-Jones died in his mid-60s. He did over 1,000 cartoons. He loved working with stained glass. And this 1871 cartoon that he created called Faith, in addition with windows called Hope and Charity, he did for a church in England. If you look at those now, and they do still exist, and they've been actually reproduced for other churches in England, they are very different. The basic structure is the same, of a woman reaching up in graceful form to what seems to be a mysterious blue cloud above her. And it's like looking, and once you know this, once you remove the basic the form, the theme of the window, the details are tremendously different. So for the painting, for Mrs. Whitten in 1896, he created something based on a cartoon, but it was with a lot of extra details that he had been thinking about for 25 years. And when he gave permission to the Boslers of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, for a stained glass window based on the painting that had been given to Mrs. Whitten, he said, I want it after the more recent painting. I don't want it based on the cartoons I have done for England. I want a cartoon created from the painting I did for Mrs. Whitten. So he started with a cartoon, did a painting a generation later, and then created a stained glass window based on that later painting. He did not see it to its final form. He died before it was done. So you think, okay, then we have to talk about the execution. And the execution means that that window did not come from England in that form. It came as a cartoon. It was executed, it was built in New York City. The interesting thing that Dan and I couldn't solve was that the glass came from either of two places. It came from Germany or it came from Indiana. I know. It's hard to tell them apart. But Indiana prides itself as having the most beautiful stained glass in the North American continent. And Germany prides itself, quite justifiably, as having the most beautiful stained glass manufacturing in Europe. I think, and Dan tended to agree with me, although he's much more scientific and less romantic than I am, I think the glass came from Germany. So what you have shipped over to the U.S. in the late 1800s is a cartoon, which means is sort of the fundamental substructure, possibly still on that giant board, that piece of wood, that Burne-Jones would have had his people in his shop, create. and be very exact about these are the colors, this is the shape, these are the details, and so forth. So it was a Burne-Jones creation. It just wasn't hand-fashioned by Burne-Jones. It was actually shipped over with all the parts. Don't think IKEA, it's not IKEA. And then executed in New York, and then shipped to Pennsylvania, and then installed by Rudy. To me and to Dan, the intriguing thing is we found that somewhere between the execution in New York and the installation by Rudy, there was some breaking going on. There have been repairs to this window before it was installed in Bosler. There have also been repairs to it after it was installed in Bosler. I swear not when I was a janitor. There was a repair, a very klutzy repair done probably sometime in the 70s, which I have not found a record of. I hope it's because they were too embarrassed to claim it at the time. But it's of a very small piece which you can't even see in this. It's quite obvious. I mean, it like slaps you in the face when you're standing up close to it. But it doesn't affect your appreciation of it from a distance, which this window was designed to be. So we have the commission, we have the execution, and we have the installation. Three major transition points. And we have, in this Burne-Jones window in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, a real rarity. You realize that the largest collection of Burne-Jones art in the Western Hemisphere is down in Delaware. You can go to the Delaware Art Museum. Stunning work, both stained glass windows, paintings. To me, one of the greatest small museums I've ever been in. Sir Andrew Lloyd Webber recently showed up at the Delaware Art Museum because he has one of the largest private collections of Burne-Jones, and he wanted to see what they had that he could be envious of. And I have mentioned this window to the Delaware Art Museum, and they're quite intrigued by it, but they said, why don't we know anything about it? And that's, I had to tell them, because I'm not really the only interested person about it. I mean, I know Bosler people love it, but I'm the one who loves to stare up close and find the repairs and, you know, chase down all the personal details of it. But this is very extraordinarily rare for North America to have. There's lots of Burne-Jones stained glass windows in England. There's a few of them here in North America. This is one of the largest. And this is one of his final ones, which makes it even more special. Burne-Jones, some of you are probably quite familiar with him, so I won't give you too many factoids that I love so much. Working class family, born in Birmingham, England, became involved in the pre-Raphaelite movement, which existed slightly before he went to Exeter College, and met William Morris, one of the great writers and designers, and I hope all of you have some at least William Morris wallpaper or lamps or something in your houses. As you know from the grief that Burne-Jones suffered after William Morris's death, and that led him to give us, in a way, this theological picture that we have. He was extraordinarily devoted to crafting things. He wanted to be tangible. The Pre-Raphaelites in general prided themselves on being craftspeople, not necessarily high theoretical artists. They wanted to make things that people would live with, that they would use, that would convey a meaning beyond just looking pretty. They viewed that the Renaissance, by veering into the secular subjects of, oh, isn't that pretty, they lost the original, what they would say was the Christian meaning of what art should be. Now I know this is picking on some big names, because when you call yourself pre-Raphaelite, that means pre-Raphael, which means one of the three great artists of the Renaissance, Raphael and Da Vinci and Michelangelo. And you've seen a lot of Michelangelo recently because of the Sistine Chapel, yes? the pre-Raphaelites, especially Burne-Jones, for instance, to give you one detail of the differences, they wanted the wonderful muscular bodies and movement of Michelangelo, but they wanted the wonderful aesthetic faces, calm, serene, dreamy faces of Da Vinci. You see how they both rejected the prettiness of the Renaissance art, but they drew upon some forms and details and ideas of Renaissance art to take it back in time to symbolic and allegorical meaning that the earlier Christian art had. This is a very amateur, quick art history, just for all of you, and I promise to now spare you from now on. But the pre-Raphaelites are important because we Americans often confuse them. Oh, they look like Art Deco to me. No, no, no. Art Deco's later. That's all about abstract form. These folks wanted content that met its form and beauty. The original Hope had an interesting, what should I say, non-textual meaning to it. There is no, this is not from Pilgrim's Progress. And believe me, it was suggested to me by my wife, who knows how much I love Pilgrim's Progress. Oh, surely this figure's from Pilgrim. Isn't there a character named Hope? Well, there's a character named Hopeful, and there's a character named Faithful, and so forth. But no, none of the details in this picture have anything to do with Bunyan. None of them, you cannot cite a psalm passage. You cannot pick out a character of the Bible and say, well, obviously that's meant to be her. No, this is it. They took it out of any textual relationship and they put it into strictly visual meaning. The iconography is important, and believe me, it'll just be a few more minutes and then I'll tell you why this all comes together for the Bosler family. The iconography, if I could just point out a few details that are kind of cool and really work best if you're there within inches of the window. Have you ever noticed the golden chain that comes down, anchored into the wall, and is locked around her ankle? Have you noticed that behind her are metal bars in which you can see the bolts that hold them to the side of the window? This woman is in a prison cell, and she's fastened to the wall with a golden chain. She has only her beautiful swirling clothes and two important different colors of gold, yellow, and red. And then she's holding this flowering branch, which is, it's a branch of apple blossoms in bloom, which I thought, okay, that's neat, we're in Adams County. But that's how simple I get with my art interpretation. And then she's holding one hand up into a cloud, a mist, blue up above her. In the distance, in the far distance, you see a classic Italian hilltop city, way up toward the top, upper left. And basically, that's it for the iconography. It's important that we have a strong, very geometrical lines and crosses down at the bottom in the tiles, and the architectural marble going up on either side, and then as I mentioned, the bars behind her. These are all to highly contrast with the flowing drapery of her garments, and of course her hair. In the original Hope and in the painting of Hope, she is a serious redhead. We got a blonde. I have no idea, but this might have been from our New York executors. I have a feeling that knowing pre-Raphaelites and knowing Burne-Jones, he probably would have preferred the original redhead. That's just my personal opinion, but we got a nice blonde. And this is what you cannot see in this photograph, and you can only guess at when you're looking at her from the floor, this is a very three-dimensional window. There is probably at least 2 inches sometimes of depth in between her hand and her drapery. In between details of the window, they're made to be thrust out at the viewer, which you can't see in a two-dimensional representation here, but you can see up close. And that's all for the effect you have when you're looking at her from like 40 to 50 feet away on the floor of the old library. That's why she seems so vivid from the floor, is because there's literally shifting levels of glass in which one glass has been supported and braced to be over the base glass. It's a very complex three-dimensional sculpture as much as it is a stained glass window. I recently had the great blessing of having a stained glass work of art installed in my store, and there were little touches of three-dimensionality, and I thought, this is so cool because it reminds me of Edward Burne-Jones. And this young lady who did mine this was her first piece, and already I was comparing her to Edward Burne-Jones. That's how much I loved what she did. The iconography is, this is mortality. Chain, the barred windows, the fact that you are doomed by being human. You could call it the curse of the garden, you could call it the way things is in this man's universe, you can call it anything you want, but the fact that you are born means that you are fated to die. And Burne-Jones knows this, but he named it hope. So the hope comes from the flowering apple blossoms, meaning that something is renewing them in spite of what should be fading dead branches. And her lifting her hand is to the unknowing gentleness of heaven, you could say. I've read some unconvincing interpretations would say, oh, it means rescue. It doesn't mean rescue. It means that you have seen something in the clouds above you that represents a future. You are not falling down on your knees, you are reaching up into heaven. Interestingly enough, all of Burne-Jones's cartoons and his painting have the woman's hand reversed in position. And I know that seems geeky and probably minor detail that you don't need to know about, but I am interested in that Lila's window has her hand reaching into the cloud. And in all the other representations, her hand is turned around and seems to be coming down. And that to me is curious, because I'd rather, as a human being, want to reach into mystery rather than defend yourself against something you don't understand. That's purely subjective, but I find the detail interesting that for our window, we have a totally unique Burne-Jones. There are details in it, the blonde hair, the position of the hand, details of the swirl of the clothing. Our drapery is much better executed than you'll find in Christ Church in England. This is extraordinarily high-end drapery compared to the windows I have seen in England. So we've got the better one. You can tell your friends that. So all this iconography goes toward the name of the title of the piece, which is Hope. That this is, despite the evidence that you have that you will tend to death, there is hope to look up into. And this is followed through by the inscription that the Bosler family insisted on, below her feet, and which I don't think you can really read from the floor anymore. It's very hard to see. But I will read to you the passage from a poet named Frederick William Henry Myers. And the intriguing thing is, and one little other additional mystery for me, is that I have how he wrote this poem in 1867, how he revised it in 1890, and then I have our version, which is on our window. I have a feeling that we're closest to the 1890 revisions, and that's what the Bosler family would have known. There's a private little rabbit trail that I had to run down. But this is what we have on our window. What shall we do, o'er whom the unbeholden hangs in a mist with which we dare not cope? In other words, what are we looking at? How does this change everything? What but look sunward, and with faces golden, speak to each other softly of hope? So in the face of mystery, this is a positive thinker's reaction. In other words, there is something we can hope for in the unknown. It seems to be hopeful. This is from a poem by Frederick William Henry Myers called St. Paul. The context in the poem is after the wreck in the Caribbean on his way to Rome, and he reflects upon the fact that we must have survived for a reason, and if we hadn't survived, it would be okay, because we know we're all bound for heaven. We're heaven bound. So it is optimistically a hopeful context. And the Boslers chose this with the subscription beneath it, in loving memory of Lila. So you think, okay, obviously they wanted to say, Lila's gone. She, according to the dates, 1869 to 1896, she died at 31 years old. We will meet her in heaven. That's a standard cemetery trope, that, see you there, wait for us, kind of thing. We do all do it. We all do it all the time. But that brings up, to me, the most intense part of the story. Because remember, the curious thing we have here is we have a building done 3 years after the death of John Herman Bosler. There's absolutely nothing in his will about taking some of my money and building the library that I wanted and tried hard to build for the past 30 years. He did do that. We all know that. He tried with his church, he tried with the Historical Society, he tried other ways, thwarted every time, was scandalized to have Amelia given in the next pew, build a library first out in Mount Holly Springs, and say, why can't I do that? Why aren't you people listening to me? There's nothing in his will to specify a library. But his family knows that he wanted one. So his family builds this huge Grecian temple here on West High Street, and then it boldly inscribes on the outside the J. Herman Bosler Memorial. That's it. They did not put library. There is no library on that building. And they put a window in to the youngest daughter of John Herman Bosler, who died tragically a year and a half before him. And they put in this window, in this building that was a memorial to John Herman Bosler, a memorial window that you notice has no book background, no literary allusion, no reference to books or literature at all, no quotes, except for that odd little passage from St. Paul by Frederick William Henry Myers. To me, there's something really curious about that. And yet everyone seemed to agree of the family without being specific, and the Boslers are famous for not being specific, let me tell you. Everyone agreed seemingly by consent, that this would be a library. And yet it's not built necessarily as one, and yet it's not dedicated in memorial as one, either to the father or the daughter. Not as a library. So who was Lila? In the spring of 1864, May 22nd, in the middle of a very dark decade of war, business crises, and sudden deaths of children, the larger Bosler clan, in fact, specifically John, Herman, and Mary Bosler family, but also the larger clan, remember there's all sorts of brothers and sisters and so forth in that second generation of Boslers, suffered a 40% mortality rate with their children. 6 survived out of 10 children. This was not shockingly unusual, but it's a shock to go back into history and find numbers like that. A baby girl was born to his 34-year-old businessman and his 28-year-old wife. She was named Eliza after her father's mother and called Liza by all. She grew up and was coddled as the baby gem of the family. Every other character in that generation, her brothers and sisters, from Herman to certainly Gertrude Bosler-Biddle, very strong, outgoing, rambunctious personalities. Just, when in doubt, push yourself to the front and shout loud, and you'll be noticed. Liza was not like that. Liza was the one who was the apple of the eye of the father and mother. In the 1870s, when Lila was a teenager, the father and his brothers began building that huge Western Empire that I mentioned last time, that's stretched to San Francisco and all across the Great Plains, and it generated an immense amount of wealth. When marriage should have been in order for Liza, she stayed home while all her brothers and sisters got married and had children, and she had lots of nieces and nephews. But she stayed home and took care of her parents. She helped her mother run the household while her father and her brothers ran the empire. In the 1890s, with the empire stretching coast to coast and employing hundreds and hundreds of employees, she met in her 30s, in her late 20s and early 30s, one Edmund T. Hooker, who worked for his father in San Francisco. She is courted by this lucky young man, and she marries him November 8th, 1893. She is 29 years old. In her home church, quote, in the presence of a large company, they moved to San Francisco. What a wrench that would have been. Those of you who are parents can imagine, this is what we want for our child, this is not what we want for our child. Simultaneously. To move 3,000 miles away, and the daughter who took care of you all these decades, in a sense, being the second mother of the family, and then off she goes. And the nest is empty. There are lots of little Boslers around in Carlisle, but the nest, the central nest, the generator, the home base of all this empire is now empty. 1 year later, Lila contracts malaria from a mosquito in San Francisco. This malaria turns ultimately fatal because it creates a kidney disease, nephritis, Bright's disease, it's also called at the time, which is extraordinarily painful and mystifies medicine at the time. She has to come home because here you are in your honeymoon year, and the only safe place you know is home in Carlisle. They take good care of her, of course. She has the absolute best of care, but this is a chronic terminal condition that she has, with occasional recoveries, tantalizing recoveries. In 1894, once she's home, interestingly enough, the month after she arrived home, John Herman Bosler writes that will. That didn't specify a library, but it does specify how his son Herman, the second oldest of his family, Gertrude, an incredibly strong-willed daughter who will later be running the library decades later, is the oldest. Herman is its oldest son. It directs Herman, here's the money I want in trust for every one of my children, and you better take care of your sister, Liza. It's interesting that it's very strong, and it's very specific, and it does not mention Edmund T. Hooker at all. But it makes sure that no matter what she can do, in other words, she has no control over her trust, and no matter what anyone else connected to her, like her husband, can do, that money will always take care of her. And he sets up similar trusts for other children as well, but there's a certain legalistic drive to that part of the will. You can detect it. It comes right through the paper. And I know I'm a romantic reader. In 1895, with Liza home, the husband stays in Omaha, Nebraska, one of the other headquarters of the Bosler Empire. He does not come back to Carlisle with her. And she never really rallies fully. The malaria is slowly wreaking havoc with her kidneys and is making it very difficult for her to get by day to day. And she has little spells of relief. She goes to a John Philip Sousa concert on March 25th, which is a Wednesday of 1896. But then by Wednesday, the following Wednesday, April 1st, it's increasingly cloudy with rain in Carlisle. The Cumberland Valley Railroad dividend is announced in the paper. The governor says that we're going to speak on behalf of all Americans. Political life goes on. The Troy Steam Laundry in time, you all remember Troy Laundry, I hope, announces that it has a telephone installed. Little daily quotidian life goes on in Carlisle. But on April 1st, she continues to sink. Thursday, April 2nd, the news goes on. Father Henry Gaunce of St. Patrick Church is playing in the Harrisburg Cathedral. He's a nationwide famous organist going on, and there he was down the street from the church that the Boslers went to. The Goeben Guards drill an extended order for an inspection soon. The detail in the Society of the papers that Joseph Bosler, Liza's uncle, rushes home quickly by train and arrives in Carlisle late Thursday on April 2nd. He was summoned. It's fair, it's colder tonight, the winds are shifting westerly. The next day, Friday, April 3rd, it's Good Friday. At 9 a.m., Lila died at home. She is in 10 West High Street, which is the building, a part of now the M&T Bank, the building that has the little chip from a cannonball above the doorway there. So you can go home, you can go into the next block and see 10 East High Street, and you can know that that's the building where Liza died at age 31 of Bright's disease from a mosquito that bit her in San Francisco in her honeymoon, at the end of her honeymoon. On Saturday, April 4th, Lila's husband Edmund arrives from Omaha, summoned, too late. They allow the family to be with her during Saturday. Sunday is Easter. no ceremony, no burials on Easter Sunday. So the burial has been arranged for Monday morning. It leaves, the procession leaves 10 West High Street at 2 p.m. and goes down by horse-drawn carriage to Ashland Cemetery, down the length of East High Street, into what is then called, and not surprisingly, Bosler Town, because that's where a lot of Bosler employees, that's where Joseph William had his mansion there in Seven Gables. And remember, the town is permeated with Boslers. It's embedded in this Bosler universe at the time. And on the day she died, on Friday, the later afternoon paper was able to say of her, noticing her death, that she held a prominent position in the social circles of Carlisle and was a young lady of intelligence and culture. She had a wide circle of warm friends both in Carlisle and the principal cities and towns of the state, all of whom will mourn her untimely death. She is a member of Second Presbyterian Church, which is no surprise because that's the Bosler Church. The funeral takes place on Monday. A year and a half later, without changing his will with one word, John Herman Bosler dies at age 67 of a brain hemorrhage. I prefer to think, the profound romantic that I am, that he died of a broken heart. Because this was the girl that he had nurtured, that he had celebrated for 30 years, allowed her to leave his care, and then she comes back to die. Two things happen in the way of memorial. One, a Bosler plot in Ashland, which I all recommend that you visit, has this lovely sort of community plot area in which Gertrude Bosler Biddle's tomb is there, plain as, you know, a soldier's tomb, and John Herman and Mary, very family, the owners who have the library, I mean the cemetery, kind of view with suspicion anybody who's in there now. But anyway, I usually don't care about that much about suspicion, but I've stopped doing it. So, we have the daughter dead. We have the father dead. We have the will that specifies nothing. Mary Kirk Bosler and the rest of the family, Herman, the adults, the son who's in charge, has a library to build. And so they build a memorial building to John Herman. And they put in the memorial window with no book allusions, no literary allusions, to Lila. And then the library opens in January of 1900, which we went over in the last talk. And then, by 1903, after the niece of the Boslers is over as librarian, in 1903, 3 years after it opened, William Homer Ames is installed as the librarian and spends his life with the window. To me, this window is an artifact, it's an abstraction, it's an Edward Jones piece that we can celebrate and say, wow, an amazing work of art. It's a little rough with the repairs, it's a little dusty up there. No, I'm not suggesting that anyone washed it or anything. I am very glad, as Dan Hayward told me, it's the safest it's ever been because it's now protected by the southern extension of the library. He and I started to have secret subversive thoughts, and I say this with our current executive director over there, of perhaps lighting the window from the south a little better so the light can show up a little bit more, not quite as spectacularly as it did for William Homer Ames, but just so people can see it from the floor of the old library. And yet, to me, you can't have an abstraction. You can't even have a great work of art by Edward Burne-Jones without thinking of Lila's story. This is a real human being who was loved by everyone in town, whose life sustained the life of her parents. And once that life was gone, they put in something and then put in the words of a poet below her, who founded in 1886 in London the Society for Psychical Research, an institute still existing, still has its American chapter up in Manhattan, that determined that yes, you can have the human personality and its survival of bodily death. That's the book he wrote. The original 2-volume version of that is over in Dickinson Library. I hope, and I'm too afraid to check to see if it's still there, but yours truly read 2 fat volumes of Frederick William Henry Meyer's conviction that human and the human soul and the human personality in whatever form, whether it's ghosts or whether it's psychic life, exists after death. They persist. The hope is tangible. It's not abstract, it's not theological, it's not based on Holy Scripture text. It's actually based on what he tried to define as science. And the Boslers took that aspect of it, not some good old Presbyterian Calvinist idea, let me tell you, but they took that sort of what we would consider almost New Age, profound analysis of what happens to the personality after one dies, and they put it up on this window called Hope, which to me is really intriguing look into the family at the time. I don't necessarily find out more about Lila, but I find out more about the family. And this was, at the time, their idea of science. A good friend of Frederick William Henry Myers was William James, son of Henry. And William James, pioneering psychologist in America, in his book Will to Believe, writes this chapter on what has psychic science produced. And he was talking specifically about Myers and his work at the Society of Psychical Research. So the Boslers, as traditional as they seem, and as old-fashioned as they seem, and as hardcore business entrepreneurs, took this element of what I call psychic faith and wanted it displayed